On this episode of China Uncensored, Sierra Leone is the first country in Africa to sidestep a debt trap set by China. Will others follow? Hi, welcome to China Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Sierra Leone, a country in West Africa more or less the size of South Carolina. In fact, it's kind of what South Carolina sees when it looks in the mirror. But unlike South Carolina, where the average life expectancy is 77 years, people in Sierra Leone live to an average of just 52. Still, that's a lot better than in 1995, when Sierra Leone was in the middle of a bloody 10-year civil war and people barely made it to age 35.
We are running, coming for town. Others were searching for food when they got hold of us. When we had that, we left the boats coming for town. We fell into their ambush. They captured us. We had full number, assembled 7 of us, 6 were killed.
Luckily, that's all in the past. Still, to this day, Sierra Leone remains one of the poorest countries in Africa. More than half the population lives below the poverty line of $1.25 a day. But recently, things seem to be looking up for Sierra Leone.
We are a successful model of stable democracy, one that has evolved and matured in 20 years from chaos and lawlessness of civil conflict.
That was the country's new president, Maada Bio, elected in April. Here he is in China at the recent Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, where China's leader Xi Jinping pledged $60 billion of loans to Africa. But President Bio made headlines last week when he overturned a huge deal with China that his predecessor, Ernest Bai Korma, signed a few years back. The plan was for a Chinese company to build the Maada Bio International Airport, with funding from a Chinese state-owned bank to the tune of $312 million. A third of that was to be from a loan that Sierra Leone would have to pay back. Sierra Leone's Minister of Transportation and Aviation announced the project's cancellation in a letter, part of which was published in the Daily Nation, a Kenyan newspaper. So instead of taking out a massive loan to build a brand new airport that it doesn't need, Sierra Leone is going to fix up the one it already has. That seems like a prudent choice, given that a recent IMF mission to Sierra Leone found that the economic environment remains challenging and hailed the new government's efforts to stabilize public debt and reduce it to sustainable levels and prioritize public investment aimed at reducing social and infrastructure gaps. It turns out that an earlier $200 million loan from China for the same proposed new airport was canceled when the IMF and World Bank did a debt sustainability analysis of Sierra Leone and expressed strong concerns about the deal. And when a formal organization like the IMF says it has strong concerns, in normal language, that means run. The risk of taking a loan from China is, let's say, different from taking a loan from the IMF. If you can't afford to pay back an IMF loan, they may impose some conditions before bailing you out with another loan. Those conditions might include making you adopt free market reforms, clamp down on corruption, or strengthen rule of law institutions. But those are generally things that make a country better and can attract future investment. But if you owe money to China and can't afford to pay up, well, they take their pound of flesh, like Djibouti, the African country of Djibouti. China recently set up a military base there, likely through political pressure. China is also helping finance the main seaport in Djibouti, but if they can't pay off its debt, and that seems likely, it may be forced to hand over its port to China. And this means China would control the key access point in and out of Djibouti. The big fear is that as China hands out loans for huge infrastructure projects around the world as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, it will use the loans that countries can't afford to pay back as a way to take resources or territory. But by bucking that trend, Sierra Leone has just become the first African country to sidestep one of China's potential debt traps. Some experts even say that Sierra Leone may be the first of a series of dominoes that are about to fall. A professor at a college in North Carolina says this cancellation is a sign that African countries are starting to wise up when it comes to the threat of Chinese loans. Now, after the Maada Bio airport deal was axed, China was quick to say, "Nothing to see here, folks. I don't think this particular project should be overblown as an indication of problems between the Chinese and Sierra Leone governments," said China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Liu Kang. And then, between the lines, expressed hope that other African countries wouldn't develop any hang-ups about taking Chinese money. When cooperating with African countries that include Sierra Leone, China has always adhered to the principles of equality-based consultations and win-win cooperation. Of course, when you see headlines like this about Sri Lanka, or this about Zambia, you wonder if the Chinese regime has a slightly different definition of win-win. I think it means if you repay the loan, China wins. If you can't repay the loan, China also wins. Win-win. So what do you think about Sierra Leone canceling its loan from China? Leave your comments below. And before we go, it's time to answer a question from a fan of China Uncensored who contributes to us through the crowdfunding website Patreon. David Michael White asks, Chris, do you have a favorite creature from Chinese mythology? Let's see. I'm going to say a qilin. It's kind of like if you combined a dragon head, the body of an ox, but with the skin of a snake. Sometimes they have 2 horns. Other times, 1 horn, which has led some people to call it a Chinese unicorn. Please, qilin are way more majestic than unicorns. Oh, and sometimes they're on fire, but not always. They may look fearsome, but they only punish the wicked. In Buddhist thought, they're vegetarian and fly because they don't want to step on even a single blade of grass. If a qilin showed up, it meant that there was a wise and benevolent ruler. So, I'm sure you won't be too surprised to learn that a lot of Chinese emperors said qilins showed up during their reign. But my favorite story about qilins involved the Chinese admiral Zheng He. He was the Chinese admiral who, in the Ming Dynasty, who sailed all the way to Africa in his fleet of Chinese treasure ships. For a guy who was a eunuch, that took a lot of guts. Anyway, he brought back 2 giraffes to the emperor, who, by the way, was very, very benevolent, and everyone was like, oh yeah, those are qilin, totally qilin. If you'd like to learn more about Chinese mythological creatures, I'd recommend a book called The Classic of Mountains and Seas. You won't find a crazier collection of strange beasts and monsters unless you read a book about the Polar Pro. Thanks for your question, David. And remember, you too can have your question answered on China Uncensored when you become a Patreon supporter. Join us at patreon.com/China Uncensored and contribute $1 or more per episode. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time. Want to know more about how the U.S. is reacting to Chinese investment in Africa? Well, on our spin-off show, America Uncovered, we just did an entire episode about that. So click here to check it out. It's great.